SNP spokesperson, Richard Thomson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. That's been quite an interesting listen, I have to say, certainly from the SNP front bench. And I'm very, very struck by the Minister being magnanimous enough to say that he feels sorry for the Labour front bench. Clearly, he feels very sorry for himself and the criticisms that have come his way. But what I haven't heard, Madam Deputy Speaker, is a single word of apology or contrition for those who are currently stuck in that backlog. And I think after that quite extraordinary performance, I think people are quite entitled, especially those languishing in that backlog, to feel a growing sense of anger at the incompetence and insouciance of this government. Now, to be very, very clear, my censure today is reserved entirely for the ministerial team that has presided over this. It's in no way a criticism of staff who have been doing their utmost in the most difficult of circumstances over the last few years to make sure that processes worked as effectively as they could. And while the volume of applications currently is perhaps unprecedented, ministers cannot, with a shred of credibility, surely claim that it was in any way unexpected. In fact, it seemed at times in recent weeks that the government has been determined not just to restrict the number of people able to come into the country, it's also been doing its level best to prevent people from getting out of the country lawfully as well. And I think that lack of humility and contrition will rightly enrage those in that backlog. A backlog which I think after how many attempts, was it 2 or 3 attempts, the Minister was still unable to say how large that backlog was. Didn't even say pass, didn't even use a lifeline to phone a friend. And I think that is absolutely telling and damning in equal measure. Now, the 10-week target that the Home Office speaks of is routinely being missed. And the Home Office has had access to passport data, including the numbers of passports that were set to expire all the way through the pandemic, and was therefore fully aware, or ought to have been at least, of the likely spike in applications that would come as soon as travel applications, as soon as the restrictions on travel were lifted. You really didn't need to be Mystic Meg to look into your crystal ball and see what was happening here if you were a minister. Now, the Passport Office is currently advising travellers to allow up to 10 weeks for those applications to be processed, up from an average of 3 weeks just before the pandemic. But we're hearing reports of delays of up to 5 months or even more in terms of applications being processed. And with few or no fast-track appointments available anywhere across the UK, due to them being fully booked, travellers are being forced to cancel travel bookings and often losing hundreds of pounds of hard-earned money in the process. And as ever, we can point to the statistics, but it's the human stories that really get to the nub of this. I was made aware in preparing for this debate of a case where grandparents had bought a holiday for their grandson as a gift for his 18th birthday, not realising that he didn't have a passport, and it's now touch and go whether or not he will be able to take up that gift. A case that comes from my own office is of a family looking to return to Scotland from the United States of America, but a lack of an ability to get a passport timorously for their children is not only risking their ability to be able to travel in accordance with their plans, but also it's preventing them getting enrolled for school. So this just isn't about holidaymakers and tourism. For many, actually having that travel document as a simple form of ID is vital for business, it's vital for family or practical reasons, or simply when it comes to accessing crucial public services. So for many, the failure of the system to process applications timorously and to issue passports is going to mean yet more forced separations from family and loved ones after the 2 years of the pandemic and the restrictions we've all been living under. People are again being deprived the opportunity to say that one final goodbye to those that they love and their nearest and dearest. Business deals and contracts are being lost if meetings cannot take place face to face, if they need to be concluded in person. The Government also needs to look at the issues that there are around about lost or stolen passport cases, which currently seem to sit outside all escalation processes. And the Passport Office is also only seeming to deal with that escalation process at the moment if the only thing that matters is the travel date. And actually, in many cases, people will need passports faster than any travel date simply to get visas from other jurisdictions in order to travel. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's not as if the government wasn't forewarned about this, because as early as July 2020, as the first lockdown eased, the issue of backlogs was being raised then with the Passport Office. And back then, the official response was that, quote, the staff were working hard to ensure that everyone with pre-planned travel does not miss out if their application has been submitted correctly and in good time. But there's been many, many issues on that a simple, bland public relations assurance cannot paper over. And we heard from the Honourable Member for Aberravon about the issues with staffing. The lack of staff is the major factor that has contributed clearly to this backlog. So the question then becomes, why hasn't the government ensured that enough people were employed to process the upsurge in line with their usual service standards? Back in 2021, the PCS union was promised that there would be an additional 1,700 staff recruited to deal with the predicted increase in applications. But the Home Office struggled to recruit for reasons that we've heard, in part due to the low wages on offer. And we've only seen about 500 additional recruits since then, most of which have been agency staff. And I believe that there are currently over 1,000 full-time equivalent agency staff in the HMPO alone, meaning that the workforce is around one quarter or between a third and a quarter agency staff. But this, of course, isn't just about a simple failure to recruit. It's also, due to the conditions, a failure to retain. Now, back in April 2016, full-time equivalent paid staff was sitting at 3,913, just over. At the time of the pandemic in April 2020, that had reduced to 3,585. By March this year, that was down to 3,232. So clearly there is a crisis of staffing here, not just in terms of being able to recruit, but also being able to retain. And I think it's impossible not to lay the blame for that at the culture which comes from the top here. There's also issues with systems. There's been delays, as we've heard, in the full rollout of the digital application programme, which the PCS union understood was to have taken over by now from the application management system. So that's clearly adding to backlogs and complexities as staff under an understaffed office is having to run two systems. So I seek clarity from the Minister. What exactly are the timescales that we're now operating to for rolling out of the DAP system? Can you explain why the AMS has continued to be used, why there has been the delays in fully deploying the DAP system, and why further staff aren't being recruited as a matter of urgency to the DAP project in order to help facilitate this and process applications on the timescales that we'd expect? But then, of course, there's a wider problem that affects this government's attitude to public services, and that is the fragmentation of the service. The Prime Minister said recently that if things didn't improve, he would consider privatising the Passport Office, seemingly oblivious to the fact that many of the performance issues can be laid directly to the impact of the privatisations and the part privatisations that have already taken place. And as one Passport Office worker said, it shows an absolute ignorance to the actual problems. And when we look at the issues in HM Passport Office at the minute, a lot of it is precisely in those privatised areas. So the government has serious questions to answer around its choice of private providers in this, particularly round about its choice of couriers, given the customer's experience of this when they finally do get a passport issued. The government's own data track, which tracks the performance of the most valuable contracts with private companies, shows that 7 were not reaching their agreed targets. 6 were rated as inadequate, and a further one is requiring improvement. And Teleperformance, which has a 5-year, near £23 million contract with the government, has been accused of giving customers poor, misleading advice, while members from across the House will be only too well aware of the pressures that their own constituency staff are now under, being put on hold for hours on phone lines trying to get through to someone who can assist our constituents. Now, I do not intend to delve into the issues that are around about TNT, other than to say that it's clearly a situation that should not have been allowed to grow and fester as it did. But I will return to what the PCS union has had to say about this and the assurances that they've sought from HMPO management about this. They have offered to work with to work on workforce planning to properly staff HMPO to cope with the applications without the need for regular overtime. They've called for a reduction in the use of contingent labour. They've sought assurances that government will work to increase remuneration levels across HMPO and sought a commitment to increase the pace of negotiations around allowances for members who are working in these customer service areas. They've sought the provision of a clear timeline for the implementation of the digital application process, and they've also sought the commitment that no further HMPO work will be either privatised or outsourced, with a guarantee that those contracts that are currently outsourced will be considered for urgent insourcing. These all seem to me to be perfectly reasonable asks as we try to get through the morass that has been created here. And I have to share my disappointment, Madam Deputy Speaker, that a letter outlining these issues for clarification and seeking assurances was apparently sent by the Union to the Deputy Director of Customer Service Operations at the Home Office on the 12th of May, and I believe, although I stand to be corrected, I believe I'm right in saying at this point in time a response to that letter is yet to be received. Madam Deputy Speaker, clearly Brexit and the leadership woes of the Prime Minister have chewed up a considerable amount of political energies and bandwidth that could have been better deployed in getting on with the day job of government over the last few years. And it's very, very easy to laugh at the puerile obsession that the government has had about the symbolism of being able to issue blue Brexit passports. Quite frankly, I wouldn't care if my passport was bright yellow with pink polka dots as long as it arrived on time to allow me to get on with what I was doing. Now, the Home Office is clearly a department which doesn't have its troubles to seek at the moment. The continued and conspicuous, I have to say, failure of political leadership over many years, with a steady procession of Home Secretaries who seem to be more interested in throwing red meat to the backbenches and playing to the culture wars gallery than they have been in getting to grips with the day-to-day issues that should concern them. We've seen it in the tragedy of Windrush, the botched handling of the Afghan and Ukrainian refugee crises, the plans to intercept boats in the Channel and jet skis, the callousness of the Nationality and Borders Act, and the looming omni-shambles of the Rwanda deportations. This Home Secretary has consistently shown that despite the bellicose, tough rhetoric from the dispatch box, the record is one simply of incompetence and failure. And quite frankly, enough is enough. Too many individuals, families and businesses have been left in limbo by this fiasco. Too many have had their plans suspended or upended or overturned. Too many have been left unable to demonstrate to authority who they actually are for the lack of those identification documents. Now, whether that's to travel, to access public services, or simply to access employment to provide for themselves and their loved ones, the government needs to get a grip, urgently.
Paul Holmes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.